There's a vending machine in a hallway in Culver City, California, that nobody thinks about anymore. It sells Coca-Cola, regular price. Nothing special about it, except that for 7 years, the company that owned that machine also owned the Dream Factory next door, the same company that decided what movies you'd cry at, what movies you'd fall in love in the dark to, what stories would define an entire decade of American culture. I want you to sit with that for a second. A soft drink company ran a movie studio. Not invested in, not partnered with, ran, greenlit the films, fired the executives, set the budgets, decided, in a boardroom in Atlanta, Georgia, 1,000 miles from any soundstage, whether Ghostbusters would even get made. This is the story of Columbia Pictures, but not the Columbia Pictures you're picturing, not the lady with the torch. I'm talking about the 7 strangest, most confused, most quietly tragic years in Hollywood studio history, 1982 to 1989, when the company that built its empire on carbonated sugar water decided it understood storytelling better than the people who'd been telling stories for 6 decades. They called it synergy. They called it diversification. What it actually was a corporation trying to bottle lightning the same way it bottled soda. Standardized, predictable, repeatable. And here's the thing that still gets me. All these years later, it almost worked. That's the part nobody wants to admit. For a moment, it looked like the soda men had cracked the code. Then it all came apart. And when it didn't just cost Coca-Cola money. It cost Hollywood something it never really got back. The last illusion that a studio could belong, in spirit if not on paper, to the people who actually loved making pictures. So let's go back to 1982, to a boardroom, and to a decision that a lot of very smart men were about to get very wrong. To understand what Coca-Cola destroyed, you have to understand what Columbia Pictures actually was before the suits from Atlanta ever walked through the door. Columbia wasn't born rich. That's important. This wasn't MGM, dripping in Louis B. Mayer's grandeur from day one. Columbia started in 1918 as something called the CBC Film Sales Corporation, and CBC, unkindly, got nicknamed Corned Beef and Cabbage by the rest of the industry. It was the cheap studio, the Poverty Row studio, the one nobody respected. It was run by a man named Harry Cohn, and Harry Cohn was, by nearly every account from people who worked with him, one of the most feared executives in the history of American film. Tyrannical, vulgar. He ran the lot like a dictatorship, and there's a famous, almost mythical, line about how you could judge a movie's quality by how many people showed up to Cohn's funeral in 1958, because it meant they wanted to make absolutely sure he was dead. But here's what Harry Cohn did that mattered. He built something real. Out of nothing, Columbia clawed its way from Poverty Row to the Little Three, and eventually stood shoulder to shoulder with the majors, winning Best Picture with It Happened One Night in 1934, a film so beloved it swept all 5 major Oscar categories, a feat that wouldn't happen again for 41 years. That's not corporate strategy. That's obsession. That's a man who slept at the studio because he couldn't stand not knowing what was happening on his sound stages. Fast forward. Decades pass. Cohn dies. The studio drifts through the 60s and 70s the way most of Hollywood did, surviving disco-era chaos, surviving the collapse of the old studio system, finding new footing with films like Kramer vs. Kramer in 1979, a quiet, devastating divorce drama that somehow beat Apocalypse Now for Best Picture. Columbia in this era wasn't the biggest studio, it wasn't the flashiest, but it had taste. It had people who understood that a film about a father learning to make French toast for his son could be more powerful than a film about a war. And that's the studio Coca-Cola bought in 1982. Not a broken company. Not a desperate fire sale. Columbia Pictures, at the moment of acquisition, was profitable. It had just come off Tootsie and was sitting on a deep well of institutional knowledge about how to make films that mattered and made money. Coca-Cola paid roughly $750 million for it. And here's the question I keep coming back to. the one that haunts this entire story. Why would a soda company want a movie studio in the first place? The answer takes us to Atlanta, and to one man in particular. His name was Roberto Goizueta. Goizueta became CEO of Coca-Cola in 1980, a Cuban-born chemical engineer who had climbed the company's ranks with a reputation for aggressive, almost ruthless strategic thinking. And Goizueta had a theory, a big one. He believed Coca-Cola shouldn't just be a beverage company, it should be an entertainment company, broadly defined. Soda was entertainment, movies were entertainment. Why not own both ends of the leisure economy? It's not a stupid idea on paper. I want to be fair to him here. Diversification wasn't some insane fantasy. Plenty of conglomerates were doing it in the early 80s. Gulf and Western owned Paramount. It looked, from 30,000 feet, like a winning formula. But here's where it started to go wrong, and it went wrong almost immediately, in ways that were obvious to anyone who'd actually worked in a film studio. Coca-Cola didn't just want to own Columbia. They wanted to manage it the way they managed Coke. And Coke is a science of repetition. You perfect a formula. You market it identically, everywhere, forever. You do not creatively reinterpret Coca-Cola. You bottle it exactly the same way, every single time. And that consistency is the entire multi-billion-dollar business model. Movies are the opposite of that. Movies are supposed to be unrepeatable, risky, weird. The things that make a film great are frequently the things that make it impossible to predict on a spreadsheet. Coca-Cola's executives, according to numerous accounts from people inside the studio during this era, kept trying to apply consumer packaged goods logic to greenlighting decisions, testing concepts with market research the way you'd test a new soda flavor, treating stars like brand ambassadors, and demanding the kind of predictable quarterly output that film production has never, in its whole history, been able to deliver. There's a story, and I want to be careful here, because so much of studio lore gets exaggerated in the retelling, but multiple sources describe Coke's corporate leadership genuinely puzzled by why a movie couldn't simply be manufactured on schedule, the way a case of Sprite rolls off an assembly line in Atlanta. Fay Vincent was installed as chairman of Columbia's studio operations, a former Coca-Cola executive, a lawyer by training, and a man who, whatever his talents, had never produced a film in his life. He was Goizueta's man. He answered to Atlanta. And when a studio chairman answers to a soda company's board rather than to the creative instincts of Hollywood, you get exactly the kind of tension that started defining Columbia almost from day one. The first real gut punch came fast. Annie, released in 1982, the same year Coke completed the acquisition, a massive, glossy, expensive adaptation of the Broadway musical, greenlit with the kind of blockbuster confidence you'd expect from a company used to blockbuster consumer products. It cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million, a genuinely enormous sum for the era, more than 50 times what it cost to make Kramer vs. Kramer just 3 years earlier, and it underperformed, badly. Think about what that number actually represented to a company like Coca-Cola. $40 million was, to them, a rounding error against annual soda revenue in the billions. To the film industry, it was a bet the size of a small nation's infrastructure budget, riding entirely on whether children in 1982 still cared about a red-headed orphan and her dog. They didn't, not enough anyway. Annie opened, stumbled, and became one of the more expensive disappointments of the decade, a film that had tested beautifully with focus groups, that had every demographic box checked, every marketing beat in place, and it simply didn't connect. It was Coca-Cola's first real taste of what happens when a sure thing, market-tested and broadly appealing on paper, meets the unpredictable, fickle reality of what audiences actually want to feel in a dark theater. I think about the executives in that boardroom, the ones who'd greenlit it with total confidence, staring at the numbers coming back. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about market research in the movie business. It can tell you what people say they want. It cannot tell you what will make them cry, or laugh until it hurts, or walk out of a theater changed. Coca-Cola had spent decades perfecting the science of the former. They were about to learn, the hard way, that Hollywood runs almost entirely on the latter. And you'd think that would have been the wake-up call. You'd think somebody in Atlanta would have said, maybe we don't understand this business the way we think we do. Instead, something strange happened. Columbia, almost despite its ownership, not because of it, started producing hits. Real ones. Tootsie had already proven the studio's creative instincts were intact. Then came The Karate Kid in 1984. Then, in that same summer, one of the defining films of the entire decade, Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters made nearly $300 million worldwide against a budget of roughly $30 million. It was, for a period, the highest-grossing comedy in American film history. It was a cultural phenomenon. The jumpsuits, the theme song, the logo on every lunchbox in the country. And for a brief, glittering moment, it looked like Coca-Cola's bet had paid off spectacularly. Soda money had somehow funded one of the most beloved comedies in American film history. But I want you to sit with what almost didn't happen here. Because the project that became Ghostbusters started as something far stranger, far more expensive, and far less commercial. A Dan Aykroyd script involving time-traveling ghost hunters across dimensions, a concept so sprawling it would have cost a fortune no studio could justify. It was Ivan Reitman who pushed to ground it, to shrink the scope down to something a crew could actually shoot on a New York City budget and timeline. That's not a decision a beverage company's market testing division makes. That's a filmmaker's instinct, the kind Harry Cohn would have recognized instantly, the kind that comes from actually understanding story, not from a demographic slide deck. Here's the deeper truth, the one that gets lost in the celebration. Ghostbusters succeeded almost entirely because of the creative people already inside and around Columbia. Ivan Reitman, Dan Aykroyd, Harold Ramis, Bill Murray. Not because of any brilliant strategic insight from Atlanta. The soda executives didn't invent the formula for that success. They didn't even fully understand it while it was happening. They just happened to be standing near it when it went off, and they were more than happy to take a bow. And that's the trap Coca-Cola fell into. They mistook the residual talent of the old Columbia, the institutional muscle memory Harry Cohn's studio had built over 60 years, for evidence that their management approach was working. They started to believe their own synergy narrative. So they doubled down. Coca-Cola pushed Columbia toward more four-quadrant, market-tested, broadly commercial filmmaking. They wanted predictability. They wanted a slate that behaved like a beverage portfolio, a reliable flagship product, some diet variations, some new flavors to test regional appeal. Executives were pressured to greenlight, based on demographic testing, rather than gut instinct, the very thing that had made Columbia's Golden Age hits work in the first place. And slowly, quietly, at first, the studio started losing the thing that made it Columbia. It started making films that tested well and meant nothing. By the mid-1980s, the cracks weren't hidden anymore. They were structural. Coca-Cola restructured Columbia's television and film operations multiple times across those 7 years, shuffling leadership, folding in acquisitions like Embassy Communications, trying, always trying, to engineer the kind of synergy that would let them cross-promote a soda campaign with a summer blockbuster the way a modern media conglomerate might today. It sounds almost prophetic now, doesn't it? Except in the 1980s, the technology, the distribution channels, the entire infrastructure for that kind of cross-media integration simply didn't exist yet. They were trying to build the future about 15 years too early, with tools that couldn't support the vision. Meanwhile, the box office kept doing what box office does, refusing to cooperate with corporate 5-year plans. For every Ghostbusters, there were multiple expensive disappointments that never found an audience. Films greenlit because they fit a marketing profile, rather than because anyone genuinely believed in them. And inside the company, something even more corrosive was happening. Talent was leaving. Directors, producers, and executives who'd built careers on creative risk-taking found themselves increasingly boxed in by corporate mandates from a leadership team that measured success in market share points, not in whether a story actually moved anyone. The people who understood why Kramer versus Kramer worked were being slowly replaced by people who understood focus groups. By 1987, Coca-Cola's own leadership had quietly begun to admit, first internally, then to Wall Street, that the entertainment diversification experiment wasn't delivering the returns they'd promised shareholders. The stock volatility tied to Hollywood's inherently unpredictable output was, ironically, exactly the kind of risk a conservative beverage company had never wanted exposure to in the first place. Coca-Cola's core business, the actual soda, was a stable, cash-generating machine. Columbia was the opposite, a business built entirely on unpredictability, on the 10% of films that succeed wildly enough to cover for the 90% that don't. You cannot run that business with a quarterly earnings mindset, and Coca-Cola, to its credit, or its detriment depending on how you look at it, eventually figured that out. In 1987, Coca-Cola merged Columbia with TriStar Pictures, another studio they'd been building since 1982, to form Columbia Pictures Entertainment, a restructuring move that on paper looked like consolidation, but in practice was the first real signal that Atlanta was preparing an exit. You don't reorganize an asset that thoroughly unless you're getting it ready to sell. And in 1989, they did. Coca-Cola sold Columbia Pictures Entertainment to Sony for approximately $3.4 billion. Now, on paper, that sounds like a triumph, doesn't it? They bought it for $750 million and sold it for $3.4 billion. That's not a failure. That's one of the most profitable corporate divestitures in entertainment history. But money was never really the point of this story. The point is what happened to the soul of the place during those 7 years. Because when Sony bought Columbia, they didn't inherit the studio of Harry Cohn, or even the studio that made Kramer versus Kramer. They inherited a studio that had spent 7 years being told its instincts didn't matter as much as its testing scores. A studio that had learned, at an institutional level, to distrust its own taste. And you can trace a direct line from that lesson to what happened next, because Sony, almost immediately, handed the keys to two producers named Peter Guber and John Peters. And Columbia's spending and creative chaos under their leadership became, in its own right, cautionary tales in Hollywood history. Coca-Cola didn't just fail to fix Columbia's fundamental vulnerability to corporate mismanagement. In some ways, they built the template for it. So what do we actually learn from the Coke bottle empire? I don't think the lesson is corporations are bad or Coca-Cola were villains twirling a mustache in Atlanta. I don't believe that, and I don't think the evidence supports it. Roberto Goizueta was, by every measure, one of the most successful CEOs of the 20th century. He took Coca-Cola's market value from roughly $4 billion to over $140 billion during his tenure. The man understood value creation on a scale most executives never touch. But that's exactly what makes this story so quietly tragic. Because the very discipline that made him brilliant at running a beverage empire, the obsession with consistency, predictability, formula, was precisely the wrong instinct for running a dream factory. Coca-Cola didn't fail because they were incompetent. They failed because they were excellent at the wrong thing, and they were arrogant enough, or maybe just hopeful enough, to believe excellence transfers across industries by sheer force of corporate willpower. It doesn't. It never has. Columbia Pictures survived Coca-Cola. It survived Guber and Peters. It survives today, folded into the Sony Pictures machine, still releasing films under that same torch-bearing lady logo that Harry Cohn built from nothing on Poverty Row. In some strange way, the studio outlived every single owner who ever tried to reshape it in their own image. But something was lost in those 7 years. Call it institutional memory. Call it creative confidence. Call it the specific, irreplaceable culture that only exists when a place is run by people who've spent their whole lives obsessed with one thing. Not because a spreadsheet told them to, but because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. Harry Cohn slept at his studio. Roberto Goizueta never once, as far as any record shows, set foot on a Columbia soundstage during a shoot. And maybe that's unfair to ask of a CEO managing a global beverage empire. Maybe it was never realistic to expect that kind of proximity from a man with 100 other businesses demanding his attention. But proximity is exactly what separates a caretaker from an owner. Cohn couldn't not be there. His entire identity was fused to that lot, for better and for far, far worse. Goizueta could walk away entirely, and did, the moment the numbers told him to. Neither man was wrong to run his business the way he did, but only one of them was ever going to protect a dream factory's soul, because only one of them understood that the soul was the asset in the first place, not the real estate, not the film library, not the distribution deals. The taste, the instinct, the willingness to be wrong in interesting ways. That's the whole story, really. Not soda versus cinema, not good versus evil. Just proximity. The difference between a man who lived inside the thing he built and a company that tried to manage a dream factory from 1,000 miles away using the only language it knew how to speak, the language of formula and market share and quarterly returns. The vending machine's still there, probably, selling Coke, regular price. Nobody thinks about it anymore.